My students mocked me for being too old to understand computers. Then I fixed their system-wide crash in 30 seconds, using code I wrote 20 years ago. When I revealed who I was, they didn't laugh anymore. I didn't say a word. That was 3 days ago. This morning, Tyler texted me saying he finally understood why real learning feels so different. My high school students said I was too old to understand computers, when actually I invented the programming language they were using. I'd been retired from MIT for 3 years when I decided to substitute teach at the local high school just to stay connected with young minds. When I walked into the AP computer science classroom with my gray hair and reading glasses, I knew I looked like a clueless old woman who'd need help turning on the computer. What these students didn't know was that every line of code they'd write for their AP exam ran through architecture I'd designed from scratch. A boy named Tyler took one look at me and announced to the class, "Great, they sent us someone who probably thinks Python is an actual snake." The room erupted in laughter as I set down my bag and approached the whiteboard. When I asked them to open their development environments, Tyler slowly explained what a computer mouse was, moving his hand in exaggerated motions while the other students filmed it. My chest tightened, but I stayed calm, remembering why I'd wanted to do this after reading reports about how poorly students understood the fundamentals of the language they were just memorizing syntax for. I needed to see firsthand how it was being taught, even if that meant enduring some teenage mockery. A girl named Chloe raised her hand and asked if I knew what Wi-Fi was, then turned to her friend and whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "She probably still uses a flip phone and thinks the internet is a series of tubes." When I pulled out my laptop to access the lesson plan, she gasped theatrically and said, "Oh my god, she actually owns a computer. I'm impressed. Do you need help finding the power button?" Tyler started explaining binary to me like I was 5 years old, using his fingers to count to 10 and asking if I understood that computers used ones and zeros. The class found this hilarious, especially when he drew pictures on the board of happy and sad faces to represent true and false values. "See, Grandma? The computer thinks in yes or no, like when you're deciding if you need your reading glasses." When I suggested we look at their current assignment, Tyler pulled up his code and immediately started lying about what it did, making up completely nonsensical explanations while his classmates nodded along, thinking they were fooling me. A student named Jackson decided to have more fun by changing all the variable names in the example code to insults about old people. Instead of username, he typed senile lady, and instead of process data, he wrote too old to understand. The class laughed hysterically as he projected it on the board, adding comments like, "This function probably confuses substitute teachers who should be in nursing homes." Chloe took it further by writing a quick program that displayed, "Old people shouldn't teach technology," in an infinite loop across my laptop screen when I stepped away to write on the board. She'd installed it remotely while I wasn't looking, and the entire class burst out laughing when I returned to find my screen filled with a scrolling message. Tyler then pulled up the actual AP exam prep materials and started intentionally teaching incorrect concepts to the class, telling them I wouldn't know the difference. He explained that recursion was just when code gets tired and needs to repeat itself, and that object-oriented programming was like when you're so old you treat your computer like a person. He kept looking at me to see if I'd correct him, smirking when I stayed quiet. Jackson found my faculty ID photo in the system and projected it on the board, then used a photo aging app in reverse to show what she looked like before computers were invented. They started a betting pool on whether I'd ever sent an email successfully, with Tyler collecting actual money while maintaining a spreadsheet of odds. They started throwing paper airplanes with binary insults written on them, things they thought I couldn't decode. Tyler wrote one that said 010001110101010101010101010, which spelled out dumb B in ASCII, showing it to everyone before launching it at my head. The entire class was in tears, laughing as the planes piled up around my desk. I was about to address their behavior when Tyler's code crashed spectacularly, taking down the entire classroom network. Everyone's screens went blue with kernel panic errors that I recognized immediately as a catastrophic failure in the memory management system. Tyler frantically tried to fix it, but he was making it worse with every keystroke, about to corrupt the entire school's system. "Stop," I said quietly, walking over to his computer. "You're about to trigger a cascade failure that will wipe every machine in this building." Tyler laughed and said, "What would you know about it, Grandma?" I pushed him aside and began typing rapidly, my fingers flying across the keyboard as I entered commands they'd never seen before, diving directly into the kernel level to isolate the corruption before it spread. "Wait," Chloe whispered, her face going pale as she recognized the diagnostic commands I was using. "Those are developer-level functions. How do you even know those exist?" My fingers moved across Tyler's keyboard with the kind of speed that comes from decades of muscle memory, entering commands that shouldn't exist in any public documentation. The diagnostic terminal opened and I navigated directly into the kernel's memory management system, typing 17 lines of code that I'd written into the architecture 20 years ago when nobody thought we'd need backdoor access. Error messages started disappearing one by one from every screen in the classroom, and I heard Chloe whisper something under her breath as she recognized the developer-level functions appearing on the projection screen. Tyler's face went white as he watched me restore the entire network in less than 30 seconds, faster than their IT department could have even diagnosed the problem. The classroom computers rebooted in perfect synchronization, their startup chimes creating an oddly musical cascade across the room. Tyler's voice cracked when he demanded to know how I knew those commands, his hands shaking as he gripped the edge of his desk. I turned to face the class, pulling off my reading glasses and setting them down carefully on the desk. "Because I wrote them," I said quietly, watching their faces change as the words registered. "My name is Dr. Margaret Smith Nakamura, and 33 years ago, I created the memory management system your entire language runs on." The room exploded into chaos as 23 students grabbed their phones simultaneously, fingers flying across screens as they searched my name. Jackson's laptop screen filled with my Wikipedia page, and his voice shook as he read aloud about my Turing Award ceremony and my contributions to over 40% of Python's core architecture. Tyler stumbled backward into his desk, knocking his coffee across his assignment papers, while Chloe covered her mouth with both hands and just stared at me. I walked to the whiteboard and started writing the actual recursion algorithm they needed for their AP exam, the correct version instead of Tyler's nonsense about tired code. 20 minutes later, I sat in Principal Daniel's office, watching him review the discipline referral I'd filed for the the entire AP computer science class. His military bearing reminded me of my late husband as he leaned back in his chair, and I appreciated that he'd already reviewed the security footage before calling me in. What they did was inexcusable, he said, tapping the referral with his pen. I told him I wanted them to learn from this, not just face punishment, though I could see from his expression that he had other ideas. Tyler sat across from us with his parents, his mother, Sophia Morrison, who I recognized from school board photos in the newspaper, and his father wearing a Python Software Foundation t-shirt that made the whole situation almost funny. Tyler kept insisting I was lying, his voice getting more desperate with each denial, until his father turned his phone screen toward him, showing the MIT computer science building that bore my name. Tyler, she literally has a building named after her, his father said, and I watched Tyler's last bit of defiance crumble. 2 hours later, I sat in my car in the school parking lot, my hands trembling slightly as the adrenaline finally wore off, and the reality of what just happened started to sink in. My phone buzzed with a text from my son David asking if I was okay, because someone had posted a video of me fixing the network crash that already had 50,000 views. I realized one of the students must have recorded the whole thing, and my quiet retirement plan of substitute teaching had just exploded across social media. The next morning, I arrived at school to find a cluster of students waiting by the main entrance, some holding printouts of my academic papers, and others with laptops open to my GitHub contributions page. A sophomore asked eagerly if I could explain an optimization algorithm from one of my papers, but Tyler pushed through the crowd with his face red, announcing loudly that this was all fake and I'd probably just memorized some commands. Fewer students seemed convinced by his protests now, especially when several of them held up their phones showing my verified Twitter account with over 100,000 followers. During second period, Tyler projected what he claimed was proof I was a fraud, a badly photoshopped image suggesting my Wikipedia page had been edited yesterday. Jackson stood up from his seat in the back of the room and told Tyler to stop, explaining that he'd found my doctoral thesis from 1987 and the original Python mailing list archives where I was mentioned in every early development document. Tyler's attempt to prove I was fake became his own humiliation, as his technical incompetence became obvious to everyone watching him fumble with basic image metadata. I wonder what goes through someone's mind when they're keeping such a huge secret like that. The way Dr. Smith Nakamura stayed quiet while Tyler taught everything wrong, was she studying how badly the basics were being taught? At lunch, Ms. Linda Foster called me from her hospital bed where she was recovering from surgery, her voice cracking with emotion as she apologized for not warning me properly about Tyler's behavior. She told me she'd specifically warned the substitute coordinator, but they must have thought I couldn't handle it. Then she mentioned she'd been my student in 2003, and my advanced algorithms course had changed her life. After lunch, Chloe approached me with none of her usual confidence, her hands shaking as she showed me her phone screen displaying her coding blog with 10,000 subscribers. She'd told them all I was a confused old lady who didn't understand technology, and now the comment section was destroying her credibility, as readers pointed out she'd been wrong about basic concepts she'd tried to teach in class. Her followers were posting screenshots of my actual publications and patents, linking to my Wikipedia page that someone had just created showing my 40-year career at MIT, and the comments were brutal about how she'd been teaching them wrong for months. She grabbed her phone back and ran out of the classroom with tears streaming down her face, while Tyler sat frozen at his desk, staring at his screen where someone had posted a video of me giving a keynote at the last Python conference. After school, I stayed late in the empty computer lab going through the curriculum Linda Foster had prepared for the AP class, and what I found made my stomach drop. The textbook was from 2019. The practice problems were just memorization exercises with no actual problem solving, and the entire section on algorithms was missing half the concepts that would be on the exam in 3 months. I pulled up the state's pass rates and saw that our school had a 33% pass rate compared to the national average of 65%, which explained why these kids were so defensive about their knowledge. The next morning, principal called an emergency faculty meeting where I showed my findings on the projector, watching several teachers shift uncomfortably in their seats as I explained how the curriculum gaps were creating insecurity that manifested as mockery. The department head crossed her arms and said we follow board guidelines exactly, and I pointed out that guidelines are minimums, not maximums, and these students deserved better preparation for college-level work. After the meeting, I was walking to my car when a man in a Tesla pulled up beside me and rolled down his window, introducing himself as Tyler's father before his voice cracked. He showed me Tyler's code on his laptop from the past year, pointing out fundamental errors that no one had ever corrected, explaining how his startup couldn't hire local graduates because they lacked basic skills. He admitted he'd pushed Tyler toward computer science, thinking it guaranteed success, but now realized his son had been faking understanding for years and was terrified Stanford would expose him as a fraud. That evening, I sat at my home computer staring at the acceptance letter from MIT offering me a full professorship to return, the position I'd planned to accept before this substitute experiment. The quiet house felt different now as I thought about Tyler's desperate need to maintain his perfect image, Chloe's misguided confidence leading her followers astray, and Jackson, who I'd noticed writing elegant code when he thought no one was watching. I closed the MIT email and opened a new document, typing up a detailed proposal to take over the AP computer class for the rest of the semester with a complete curriculum overhaul. The next morning, I presented it to principal, who looked at the salary difference between substitute pay and what I could make consulting, and asked if I was serious about teaching teenagers for pennies. I told her these kids tried to humiliate me because fear makes people cruel, and fear isn't a foundation for learning anything meaningful. She approved my proposal immediately, and that evening I got an unexpected dinner invitation from Sophia Morrison, Tyler's mother. At their massive house, she showed me Tyler's color-coded study notes covering every wall of his room, 18 hours of memorization for each test, desperate attempts to map every possible question without understanding the underlying concepts. She poured wine with shaking hands and asked if Stanford would destroy him, and I told her gently that we had 3 months to rebuild his foundation from scratch. The next morning, I arrived at school at 6:30 to find Jackson already in the computer lab, working through advanced problems I recognized from graduate-level courses. He admitted he'd finished the school curriculum sophomore year and had been teaching himself from MIT OpenCourseWare ever since, but he kept quiet because Tyler mocked anyone who showed genuine interest in learning. When I looked at his code more closely, I saw natural talent being wasted, elegant solutions hidden behind deliberately sloppy copy variable names so he wouldn't stand out. During class that day, I announced we were starting over with fundamentals, and Tyler shot up from his seat yelling that I couldn't change the curriculum because his parents expected him to pass the AP exam. I pulled up the statistics showing 67% of our students scored 2 or below last year, asking if he'd rather fail while understanding nothing or risk trying something different that might actually prepare him for Stanford. He slumped back in his chair as the reality hit him, and that afternoon I got an email from Chloe's mother with a signature showing she was a senior engineer at Google. When I called her, she broke down explaining how Chloe refused her help, calling her too old to understand modern coding, while writing scripts that could land her in legal trouble because she thought hacking worked like movies. We agreed to meet privately that weekend, and I spent Saturday creating personalized learning plans for each student based on their actual skill levels rather than their grades. Tyler's plan started with basic logic gates and Boolean algebra he'd never learned. Chloe's focused on ethics and security protocols with real-world consequences, and Jackson's included challenges from competitive programming sites to keep him engaged while helping others. Each plan included examples from my own failures and struggles learning these concepts, showing them that even Turing Award winners had to start somewhere, and made plenty of mistakes along the way. 3 days later, the classroom door swung open during my recursion lesson, and the superintendent walked in carrying a clipboard. She took a seat in the back corner while I continued drawing the food delivery problem on the board. I'd worked on this exact algorithm for DoorDash last year, when they needed to cut delivery times by 12%. The students were mapping out routes between restaurants and houses, not even noticing they were building recursive trees. Tyler actually raised his hand to suggest checking each route against itself, which was exactly the breakthrough the problem needed. Jackson started coding the solution while Chloe debugged his syntax errors in real time. The superintendent scribbled notes as students who'd been failing 2 weeks ago now solved problems that stumped most college freshmen. After class, she cornered me by my desk and pulled out 3 printed emails from angry parents. She read Sophia's complaint about destroying her son's confidence, then showed me another parent claiming I was teaching graduate-level material to high schoolers. I grabbed my laptop and pulled up 5 years of AP exam free response questions, scrolling through problems about binary search trees and hash tables and dynamic programming. The approved curriculum covered maybe 40% of what these kids would face in May. She took photos of my screen, then left without saying whether she'd support me or shut me down. That evening, I drove to Linda's house where she was recovering from her breakdown, and she met me at the door with boxes of papers. Her dining table was covered with printed emails she'd sent to administrators begging for curriculum updates over the past decade. Every request had been denied due to budget constraints or committee delays or district politics. She handed me a flash drive containing hundreds of real-world programming problems she'd collected from tech companies, competition sites, and university courses. 2 days later, Tyler lingered after everyone else had left, staring at his laptop screen. He turned it toward me, showing my GitHub profile from 1994, specifically the compression algorithm I'd written that became the foundation for 3 major file formats. He couldn't understand the comments I'd written, much less the actual code, and his voice cracked when he asked how he was supposed to succeed at Stanford if 30-year-old code looked like alien language to him. The next morning, principal called me to his office where Sophia sat with a man in an expensive suit who slid a document across the desk. They wanted me to return to the original curriculum immediately, or resign, claiming my teaching methods were causing Tyler psychological distress that could affect his Stanford admission. The lawyer tapped the paper and mentioned potential damages if Tyler's GPA dropped even 1/10 of a point. I left the meeting and called Professor Liu at Stanford directly from my car. He admitted they'd been tracking the problem of unprepared students for years, watching kids with perfect GPAs fail basic programming assignments in their first semester. When I mentioned Tyler Morrison from our school, he pulled up their data showing that historically, 8 out of 12 students from our district either dropped out or switched majors within a year. The next afternoon, I found Chloe in the library surrounded by cybersecurity books, actually reading instead of skimming for test answers. The superintendent showing up with parent complaints while students are solving college-level problems is peak irony. Nothing says stop teaching them too well, like watching kids actually succeed at hard stuff. She showed me news articles about teenagers facing federal charges for hacking their schools, charges that could mean real prison time. Her blog now had a genuine apology post, and a series about ethical hacking and legal boundaries that teachers should have covered years ago. 5 days later at the school board meeting, Sophia stood at the podium claiming I was experimenting on students and destroying their futures. She projected Tyler's code on the screen as evidence of his programming excellence, but board member Dr. Harrison, who'd retired from IBM, interrupted her presentation. He pointed out that line 47 created an infinite loop that would crash any system, and line 82 would fail with more than 100 data entries. Tyler found me the next morning with red eyes and trembling hands, showing me his Stanford acceptance letter in one hand and his phone in the other. Professor Liu had called him personally to explain that he'd need to pass their internal assessment or lose his spot, regardless of his high school grades. His mother was threatening to sue everyone involved if his GPA dropped, but he knew he couldn't pass Stanford's test with what he'd learned from the approved curriculum. That evening, I sat alone in my empty classroom grading papers when Carl the janitor rolled his cart through the door. He'd been cleaning these rooms for 20 years and had watched hundreds of kids graduate with perfect grades and 0 real skills. He emptied my trash can slowly, mentioning how Tyler was actually smart enough to learn if his mother would just let him fail a few times first. Carl pushed his mop bucket toward the door and paused to look back at me with sad eyes before leaving me alone with a stack of ungraded papers. My phone buzzed with an encrypted email from Jackson showing charts and data he'd spent weeks compiling about our school's AP scores. The numbers made my stomach drop as I scrolled through testimonials from kids who'd gotten perfect grades here but failed their first real programming class in college. Jackson had documented everything but was too scared to present it to the school board because Tyler's mom had connections everywhere in town. 3 days later, I was teaching my morning class when the door opened and a process server walked straight to my desk with legal papers. The man handed them to me in front of 28 students who all stopped typing to stare as I read Sophia's lawsuit, claiming I'd caused emotional distress and interfered with Tyler's Stanford admission. Tyler sank lower in his seat while his face turned red, and several students started whispering angrily about how crazy his mother was being. Chloe actually stood up from her desk and said this was insane because I was the best teacher they'd ever had. More students nodded and murmured agreement, including kids who'd who'd thrown paper airplanes at me just weeks earlier. The bell rang and students filed out slowly while I sat there holding the lawsuit papers with shaking hands. That evening, David flew in from Seattle after I'd texted him about the legal threat, and he immediately offered to get Microsoft's lawyers involved. He paced around my living room explaining how every tech company needed properly trained graduates, and this threatened their whole pipeline. I shook my head and told him this had to be solved by the community, not corporate lawyers, because these parents needed to understand what they were doing to their children. He stayed for 3 days helping me organize my defense while also setting up better security on my devices after finding someone had been trying to hack my accounts. Saturday morning, I met Linda at a small coffee shop downtown, where she looked healthier but still tired from her recovery. She pulled out a laptop and showed me spreadsheets she'd been keeping for years documenting the grade inflation at our school. Students who couldn't write basic loops were getting A's because their parents complained to administrators who then pressured teachers to pass everyone. Linda had emails and recorded conversations proving the whole system was rigged, and she'd been building a whistleblower case when she got sick. She handed me a flash drive with everything copied onto it and told me to be careful because people had already threatened her when she'd started asking questions. Monday morning, I noticed Tyler's desk was empty, and when I checked with the office, they said he was on approved absence for mental health reasons. Jackson pulled me aside after class and quietly explained that Tyler had tried Stanford's preliminary assessment test and couldn't solve even the basic problems. The kid had a full panic attack when he realized he couldn't do any of it, and his mom was blaming me, even though everyone knew he would have failed anyway. 2 days later, I was eating dinner when David called to tell me Sophia was on the local news claiming I was a vindictive professor destroying children's dreams. Within an hour, my Wikipedia page was vandalized with horrible accusations, and my MIT email filled with hundreds of hate messages. Someone posted my home address on Twitter, and David immediately started working on cybersecurity measures while I realized this had gone way beyond a simple education dispute. The next morning, Tyler's father Marcus showed up at my classroom door asking if we could talk privately. He looked exhausted as he told me he was filing for divorce because Sophia had been doing this Tyler's whole life. Marcus showed me receipts for services that wrote Tyler's essays and did his homework while Sophia bullied any teacher who wouldn't give him perfect grades. His voice cracked when he said his son was 17 and had never actually succeeded at anything on his own and now didn't know how to handle failure. That night, I found the original video of Tyler mocking me and watched it again, but this time noticed something different. 3 students in the back weren't laughing at all and looked uncomfortable or even scared while Tyler performed for the camera. One was Jackson, but the other 2 were quiet kids who never participated in class discussions, and I realized Tyler's bullying went way deeper than just that one incident. The principal called me into his office the next day and showed me a petition with over 200 student signatures asking me to stay. He explained that students from other grades had heard I was teaching real programming, and they all wanted to transfer into my class. His hands shook slightly as he admitted he was torn between supporting good education and avoiding more legal troubles with angry parents. 2 days later, Chloe's mother, who worked at Google, published a technical assessment comparing our curriculum to what entry-level programmers actually needed to know. Her LinkedIn post went viral within hours, as she stated bluntly that our school was sending kids to top universities completely unprepared for real work. Tech industry leaders started sharing her post and adding their own horror stories about interns with perfect grades who couldn't write basic code. My phone buzzed frantically while I was grading papers at home that evening. Linda's name flashed on the screen 5 times in a row before I finally picked up. Her voice was shaking as she told me to check my email immediately. The attachment she'd sent contained 3 years' worth of messages between Sophia and various teachers at the school. I scrolled through email after email where Sophia explicitly threatened teachers' jobs if they didn't give Tyler the grades she demanded. One message from last year stated plainly that she didn't care if Tyler understood the material because his GPA was non-negotiable. The most shocking part was a bank transfer receipt showing she'd paid a college student $5,000 to complete all of Tyler's AP computer science projects. My hands trembled as I read teacher after teacher describing how Sophia had cornered them, threatened lawsuits, and made their lives miserable until they changed Tyler's grades. Around 10 that night, someone knocked on my door, and I found Tyler standing there looking like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes were red and his hands kept shaking as he told me he'd heard about the emails. He admitted he knew his mom had been forcing teachers to change his grades, but swore he didn't know about the money. His voice cracked when he confessed he couldn't even write a basic sorting algorithm despite his perfect transcript. He sat on my couch and broke down completely, explaining how Stanford would destroy him academically. His mother had built her entire identity around him being a Stanford computer science student, and he couldn't bear to disappoint her. I made him tea and spent the next 3 hours teaching him actual programming concepts from the beginning. We started with variables and worked our way up to basic loops, then moved on to functions and finally recursion. For the first time since I'd met him, I saw genuine curiosity in his eyes when he finally understood how recursion actually worked. He asked why everything suddenly made so much more sense than anything he'd memorized for tests. I explained the difference between learning and performing, between understanding concepts and just repeating what you've been told. The next morning, the students who'd signed the petition had organized what they called a coding boot camp in the computer lab. Kids from other classes started showing up, cramming into every available space while I taught real programming skills. Jackson surprised everyone by becoming a natural teaching assistant, patiently helping struggling students debug their code. The energy in that room reminded me of my best days at MIT, with students actually excited about learning. We were 3 days into the boot camp when security showed up with official papers. Sophia had obtained a restraining order preventing me from teaching Tyler or interfering with his education in any way. What makes someone pay $5,000 to fake their kid's homework instead of spending that money on real tutoring? Tyler breaking down and actually wanting to learn makes me wonder how different his life could have been if his mom had just let him struggle and grow from the start. The officers escorted me from the building whenever Tyler was in class, which meant I could barely teach since we shared the same period. Students filmed the whole humiliating process, but this time their cameras were documenting injustice rather than participating in mockery. 2 days later, the MIT Computer Science Department released an official statement that made headlines in tech publications. 40 professors, including 3 more Turing Award winners, had signed a letter supporting my efforts to improve K-12 education. They announced a new scholarship program for students from schools that adopted evidence-based computer science curricula. The The statement pointedly excluded Lexington until significant changes were made to their program. Jackson found me after school that day with a message from Tyler written in binary. Tyler had been secretly watching live streams of the bootcamp sessions through friends' phones. His message explained that he was learning more from these videos than 4 years of regular classes. His dad had given him a burner phone that his mom didn't know about so he could keep studying. The school board called an emergency meeting that Thursday night that turned into complete chaos. Dr. Harrison, the retired IBM engineer on the board, presented his own investigation into our computer science program. He'd reviewed 4 years of AP computer science students' code submissions and found that over 60% showed clear signs of plagiarism or external completion. He stood at the podium and declared we weren't running a school, but a grade laundering operation. Sophia stormed out when he suggested bringing in independent auditors to review all advanced placement programs. The next day, Chloe organized what she called a student code review in the cafeteria after school. One by one, students stood up and admitted their real skill levels compared to their transcripts. A girl named Amy broke down crying when she confessed she had a perfect GPA but couldn't debug even simple programs. She kept asking what would happen when she got to college and couldn't fake it anymore. The whole session was live streamed on TikTok and got 100,000 views in just 2 hours. Parents started calling the school demanding answers about why their kids couldn't actually do what their grades suggested. That evening, I received a forwarded email that changed everything. Stanford's computer science department chair had sent a message to all early admits from Lexington High. Due to concerns about preparation standards, every admitted student would have to pass Stanford's own assessment exam before enrollment. The email made it clear this was non-negotiable and no exceptions would be made. Tyler had forwarded it to me with just one word typed below it asking for help. Sophia's lawsuit suddenly seemed pointless if Tyler couldn't even get into Stanford after all her efforts. Marcus filed custody modification papers the next morning at the courthouse downtown. The filing stated that Sophia's educational abuse constituted child endangerment and included screenshots of the grade purchasing websites she'd been using. He attached evidence showing Tyler had attempted self-harm after failing Stanford's practice test and that Sophia's response was hiring more tutors instead of getting him mental health support. The court clerk's eyes widened as she read through the documents and immediately marked it as an urgent case. Within hours, the filing became public record, and parents at school started texting each other about what Marcus had revealed. 3 days later, I sat in my home office reviewing Tyler's actual code from our secret sessions for the first time. The functions were basic, but they were real. Each line typed by his own fingers without any help from paid services. A simple loop to print numbers, a function to add 2 variables, an if statement that checked passwords, all elementary but genuine learning from someone discovering how to think logically at 17. My chest tightened seeing how far behind he really was, but also how much progress he'd made in just a few weeks of honest work. Jackson showed up at my door that afternoon with his laptop and a folder full of papers. He explained that the students wanted to create their own assessment system to prove what they really knew versus what their transcripts claimed. He opened his laptop and showed me a framework they'd already started building. Sophisticated code that revealed they'd been teaching themselves online while getting automatic A's for doing nothing. The other students had been meeting secretly at the library, desperate for colleges to see their real abilities instead of their purchased grades. 2 days later, we sat in the courthouse for Sophia's preliminary hearing. My lawyer from the Electronic Frontier Foundation arranging papers at our table. She presented evidence to the judge showing that Sophia had been fraudulently representing Tyler's abilities to Stanford, including forged recommendation letters and plagiarized application essays. The judge leaned forward and asked Sophia directly if she was suing me for teaching her son too well or for refusing to participate in academic fraud. Sophia's lawyer immediately requested a recess. His face red as reporters in the gallery scribbled notes. Tyler texted me that night from his father's apartment where he'd secretly taken Stanford's assessment exam online. He'd failed completely, scoring in the bottom 10%, but his voice sounded lighter when he called afterward. He said it was the first real grade he'd ever earned, and now he knew exactly what he didn't understand, which felt better than pretending. His father had sat with him during the test, watching his son struggle with basic concepts, but encouraging him to keep trying. The next morning, a Washington Post education reporter published an article about Chloe's live stream and Linda's whistleblower documents. The headline read, "How One Mother's Lawsuit Exposed Academic Fraud in America's Top Schools," and within hours it was trending nationally. Federal investigators arrived at Lexington that afternoon, seizing computers and demanding access to grade records going back 5 years. Sophia's lawsuit suddenly became evidence in a much larger federal case about educational standards violations. Principal called me into his office 2 days later with a surprising proposal. He wanted to restructure the entire advanced placement program and asked if I would lead the committee. He showed me support letters from 20 other teachers who'd been fighting the grade inflation system alone for years. He said Sophia might have done them a favor since her lawsuit brought attention they couldn't get otherwise. That weekend, Tyler and his father showed up at one of my coding bootcamp sessions at the community center. Marcus sat next to his son, both of them struggling with basic variable declarations, but working as a team for the first time. Marcus told me he'd taken a sabbatical from his startup to learn what his son should have learned so he could actually help him. They stayed after class practicing together, Tyler teaching his dad what he'd just learned, both of them laughing at their mistakes. Linda returned to school the following Monday, still weak from her illness but pulling a wheeled cart full of banker's boxes. She met with the federal investigators in the conference room, spreading out 7 years of documentation across the table. She showed them not just Sophia's activities, but an entire network of parents sharing resources for cheating, lists of teachers who could be intimidated, and contact information for essay writing services. The investigators' eyes widened as she explained how the parents had private Facebook groups where they coordinated their efforts and warned each other about teachers who wouldn't cooperate. The lead investigator mentioned this could expand into RICO violations since it appeared to be organized crime. 3 days later, Sophia appeared at my front door at 10 at night, mascara running down her face. She begged me to just pass Tyler, offering to drop the lawsuit and pay me whatever I wanted. When I shook my head, she switched tactics instantly, her tears drying as she threatened that she knew people in tech who would ensure I'd never work again. She claimed she could get MIT to revoke my emeritus status with one phone call to the right donor. I kept my phone recording in my pocket the entire time, capturing her admission that she'd been buying grades for years and would destroy anyone who got in her way. The next morning, Jackson texted me screenshots of something incredible happening online. online, students from my class had started a GitHub repository called Honest Transcript, where they posted code they'd actually written themselves, with timestamps and version control proving it was their own work. Within 3 days, over 500 students from schools across the country had joined, uploading their real projects with comments about what they'd learned from their mistakes. Tyler posted his first program that afternoon, just a simple calculator, but every line was his, and watching him struggle through basic loops for hours before getting it right was more impressive than any of his fake advanced projects. Colleges started noticing too, with admissions officers commenting on the repository, and some schools announcing they'd consider these verified projects and applications. Day 40 brought a package to my door with no return address, just a USB drive wrapped in newspaper. The drive contained screenshots from a dark web forum where parents traded services like buying grades and test scores, and right there as a moderator was Sophia selling guaranteed admission strategies for $50,000 per student. The timestamps went back 6 years, showing she'd been running this before Tyler even started middle school, with detailed spreadsheets of which teachers could be bribed and which administrators would look the other way. Tyler's binary message through a burner phone from his dad is peak teenage spy drama meets coding class. Nothing says learning programming in secret like sending messages in ones and zeros behind mom's back. I forwarded everything to the FBI agent handling the case, and within hours they confirmed the evidence matched their ongoing investigation into academic fraud rings operating across 12 states. Meanwhile, Chloe had completely changed, her blog now teaching actual coding skills instead of shortcuts. And when she stopped by my classroom, she was practically glowing with excitement about getting accepted to DEF CON's ethics workshop. Her mother stood behind her with tears in her eyes, watching her daughter talk about wanting to help other students learn the right way instead of cheating their way through. 3 days later, the FBI showed up at school during second period with a warrant for all of Sophia's records. Through the classroom window, we watched 6 agents escort her out in handcuffs while she screamed about lawyers and connections. But the agents just kept walking her to the black SUV parked by the main entrance. Tyler watched from the window without moving, his face completely blank until his mother was driven away. Then he let out a breath like he'd been holding it for years and whispered that maybe now he could actually learn something real. Stanford called him that afternoon to officially rescind his admission, but Professor Liu surprised everyone by adding that if Tyler could show real improvement and reapply next year with honest work, they'd consider him because they valued growth over perfection. Tyler decided right there to take a gap year, working at his dad's startup while learning to code from scratch, spending nights debugging simple programs instead of faking complex ones. The school board meeting that week was packed with angry parents demanding to know how their kids would get into college without grade inflation, but the board voted unanimously to implement my new curriculum with Linda returning as department head. Dr. Harrison stood up and announced they were restructuring assessment across all subjects, not just computer science, because the fraud investigation had revealed corruption in every department. Parents protested outside with signs about ruining their children's futures, but their complaints felt empty now that everyone knew about the bribery and fake transcripts. 2 days later, Tyler asked to speak to my class, standing at the front of the room where he'd once mocked me for being old and clueless. He apologized to everyone, but especially to me, admitting he'd been terrified I'd expose him as a fraud from day one, and that getting caught was actually the best thing that ever happened to him because now he was learning for real, and failing was actually okay. The class clapped genuinely this time, not the sarcastic slow clap from before, but real applause for someone brave enough to admit their mistakes. I spent the next evening writing college recommendation letters based on students' actual abilities, describing Jackson's self-taught expertise and natural teaching skills, Chloe's ethical transformation and community building. But when I got to Tyler's letter, I sat there for an hour trying to figure out what to write about someone starting over from nothing. The federal investigation kept expanding as more evidence surfaced, revealing Sophia's network included over 200 parents across multiple states, generating millions in fraud that the media started calling Gradegate, with congressional hearings already scheduled. They subpoenaed me to testify about educational standards and the pressure teachers face to inflate grades, turning my quiet substitute teaching experiment into the center of national education reform debates. Day 50 arrived with Marcus bringing Tyler to meet Stanford's admissions team over video, where Tyler honestly explained his journey from fraud to failure to finally learning for real. He admitted he couldn't code at Stanford level yet, but he was learning how to actually learn for the first time in his life, and the admissions officer smiled, saying that kind of self-awareness was worth more than perfect grades. 2 days later, the federal investigators called me at home saying they needed to see me immediately about something they'd found on the school computers during their discovery process. I drove to the courthouse where 3 agents were waiting with laptops open, showing lines of code I recognized as advanced keylogger software hidden deep in the system files. The lead agent pointed to timestamps showing the software had been installed 3 years ago, right when Sophia joined the Parent Technology Committee. They'd tracked every keystroke from every teacher's computer, captured every test question as it was typed, recorded every password and private email about struggling students. The software sent everything to an encrypted server that Sophia controlled from her home office, giving her access to upcoming exam questions months before students saw them. The agent scrolled through thousands of stolen test files while explaining that every AP exam for the past 3 years was compromised, meaning hundreds of students would need to retake their tests. Within hours, the news broke nationally, and the College Board held an emergency meeting where they announced they were redesigning the entire AP computer science curriculum based on recommendations from actual programmers. They contacted me directly asking for input on testing real problem-solving skills instead of memorization, and I spent the next 12 hours writing proposals for hands-on coding challenges. Day 52 arrived with news crews outside the school, as parents demanded answers about whether their kids' college applications were now worthless. I found Tyler in the computer lab at 6 in the morning, dark circles under his eyes as he typed line after line of recursive functions on his screen. He showed me his latest attempt at solving a problem that had taken him 3 hours to debug, and when it finally ran correctly, he actually teared up. His fingers shook as he explained he'd been dreaming in code patterns, seeing loops and functions when he closed his eyes. I watched him tackle another problem, making mistakes but learning from each one, building real understanding instead of copying solutions. Meanwhile, Jackson got an email from MIT saying they'd been watching his contributions to the student-built transcript system and wanted to offer him early admission. He hadn't even even applied through the normal process, but they'd found his GitHub profile and saw him solving real problems that mattered. 3 other universities contacted students who'd helped build the Honest Transcript platform, recruiting them based on actual skills rather than test scores. The Congressional Committee investigating education fraud scheduled me to testify about what I'd discovered, and I spent days preparing evidence about the broken system. Walking into that hearing room in Washington with cameras from every major network pointed at me, I explained how we were failing an entire generation. I showed them Sophia's stolen tests, Tyler's fake projects, the whole culture of cheating that had replaced actual learning in our schools. The committee members looked shocked as I demonstrated how easy it was to game the current system and how many parents were doing exactly that. Millions of teachers watched the live stream and started sending me their own stories of pressure from parents to inflate grades and ignore cheating. Day 55 brought more chaos when Sophia, out on bail, posted a video claiming I'd planted all the evidence against her as revenge for exposing my teaching methods. But Tyler had been recording everything on his phone for weeks, and he immediately uploaded the original footage showing his mother admitting to the grade manipulation. He posted a statement saying he was done protecting her and that I'd saved him by forcing him to actually learn instead of fake his way through life. The prosecutor added the false accusation to Sophia's charges, while Tyler moved in with his dad full-time to escape his mother's influence. I sat alone in my empty classroom after returning from the congressional testimony, my phone buzzing with hundreds of messages from teachers worldwide sharing similar stories. The problem was so much bigger than just one rich suburban school, reaching into every corner of education where parents valued credentials over competence. My hands trembled as I read story after story of teachers forced to pass students who couldn't do basic work because of parental threats and administrative pressure. 6 months after that first day when Tyler mocked me for being old, Chloe stood on stage accepting a national cybersecurity competition trophy she'd earned legitimately. She explained to the audience how she used to think hacking meant breaking things, but now understood it meant understanding systems deeply enough to improve them. 3 major security firms offered her internships based not on her grades, but on her transformation story and the ethical hacking skills she'd developed. Day 58 arrived with Sophia's criminal trial, where Tyler took a stand to testify against his own mother about years of academic fraud. His voice stayed steady as he described how she'd stolen his chance to fail and learn, how every success had been hollow because it wasn't really his. The judge listened as Tyler explained that failure was how people learned and his mother had robbed him of that essential experience. Sophia's lawyer saw the jury's faces and immediately requested a plea deal, knowing they couldn't win against her own son's testimony. The principal called an assembly to announce that our school would pilot a completely new computer science curriculum designed by me and Linda with input from tech companies. No more teaching to standardized tests, but actual problem solving, debugging, learning from errors, building things that worked in the real world. 2 weeks later, I was grading papers in my classroom when someone knocked on the door, and there stood Guido van Rossum himself, the actual creator of Python. Tyler standing up to testify against his mom must have been incredibly hard. I wonder if his steady voice came from finally feeling free to tell the truth after years of pretending. My hands froze on the keyboard as he walked in wearing jeans and a conference t-shirt, looking exactly like his Wikipedia photo but older. He pulled up a chair next to Tyler's desk where the kid was working on his basic calculator program for the 10th time that week. Tyler looked up confused until Guido introduced himself, and the poor kid's face went white as he realized who was sitting next to him. The Python Foundation had contacted Guido about our Honest system after seeing news coverage, and he'd flown in from California to see it himself. He watched Tyler delete his code and start over when he hit a bug, nodding as the kid explained he was learning to understand errors instead of copying Stack Overflow solutions. Jackson showed him the peer teaching schedule where students taught each other what they'd figured out that day. Chloe demonstrated her security analysis tool that she'd built from scratch after finally understanding how encryption actually worked. Guido spent 3 hours reviewing their work, asking questions that made them think deeper, and finally announced the Python Foundation would fund our program nationally because the industry desperately needed engineers who could admit what they didn't know. Tyler's hands were shaking so bad he could barely type when Guido looked at his simple calculator and said those 3 words that changed everything for him. The next day, I sat at my desk grading their final projects, real programs that actually did something useful even if they weren't perfect. Tyler had built a grocery list app that was basic, but every line showed he understood what it did. Jackson created a study scheduler that helped students track their actual learning progress, not just grades. Chloe's password manager included detailed comments explaining her security choices and admitting where she wasn't sure if her approach was best. Every project had bugs and limitations clearly documented, showing they understood their own code's weaknesses. These were the first real grades I'd ever given based on actual understanding, not memorized solutions. That afternoon, MIT called offering me a position leading their new K-12 outreach program designed to prevent another GradeGate scandal. The dean explained they needed someone who understood both the technical and human sides of education reform. The salary was triple what I made substitute teaching, and the resources were unlimited. But I looked at my students working on their next projects. Tyler helping a freshman understand loops, Jackson debugging with patience instead of frustration, Chloe teaching ethical hacking principles. These kids still needed me, and I'd found something here I hadn't expected. Tyler stayed after class to tell me about his gap year plan, how he'd work part-time at his dad's startup while taking community college courses to build real skills. He wasn't sure if he'd reapply to Stanford or even go to a 4-year school at all anymore. Learning because he wanted to understand instead of needing the credential was completely new for him, and he actually smiled talking about it. 3 days later, the federal investigation's final report dropped like a bomb on every news site simultaneously. The standardized testing companies had been taking bribes to overlook statistical anomalies and score patterns for years. Thousands of perfect scores that should have triggered reviews were ignored for the right price. The entire AP system faced federal restructuring, and our students' Honest system was named as the model for new national assessment frameworks. Parents groups were screaming, colleges were panicking, and my inbox had 400 emails from reporters. The courtroom was packed when Sophia appeared for sentencing after accepting her plea deal for 5 years in federal prison. She had to pay full restitution to every defrauded institution and received a lifetime ban from any educational involvement. She stood there in her designer suit telling the judge she was just trying to help her son succeed like any good mother would. Tyler stood up in the gallery, and his voice carried across the silent courtroom as he responded to her statement. The judge nodded as Tyler sat back down, and Sophia was led away in handcuffs without looking at her son. The new semester started with completely different energy in my classroom as students who'd mocked me now raised their hands with real questions. The quiet kids who'd hidden in the back participated actively, sharing their confusion without shame. Everyone understood that struggling meant learning, not failing. A new student asked if the rumors were true that I made class harder, and one of my original students told him I taught thinking, not memorizing. Linda and I spent weekends designing assessment rubrics that measured understanding through problem solving, not regurgitation. She kept saying she'd been teaching 20 years but was finally doing it right, finally seeing students learn instead of just perform. Districts nationwide contacted us weekly, wanting to implement our methods, and we created training materials for free. The revolution that started with teenage mockery had become an actual movement-changing education. The National Education Conference in March was supposed to be routine until my students got invited to present their honest system to 2,000 educators. Tyler stood on that huge stage demonstrating his journey from zero knowledge to basic competence with his simple but functional code. Chloe explained ethical hacking while showing how she'd learned by admitting what she didn't understand first. Jackson showed the peer teaching model where students became teachers once they truly grasped concepts. The audience of professors, tech leaders, and policymakers gave them a 10-minute standing ovation because these teenagers had redesigned education from the ground up. Stanford's announcement came during our last week of school, a complete restructuring of their admission process, where students could submit portfolios of real work instead of test scores. Tyler reapplied with his basic but genuine code, his testimony about the academic scandal, and an essay about learning to fail. The admissions director stated publicly that perfect grades meant nothing if they weren't earned through actual understanding. The Python Foundation contacted me 2 weeks later with news that made my hands shake as I read the email on my phone. They were putting $10 million behind the honest assessment system, and they wanted Jackson as a student consultant since he'd been part of the original class that exposed everything. Chloe got hired for the development team to work on security, making sure nobody could hack the system to fake their scores. Even Tyler's friend Even joined to test the interface, since he admitted he still struggled with basic concepts and could help make it work for real beginners. I watched them all working together in the foundation's temporary office space they'd set up downtown, building something that would change how kids learn to code forever. MIT's dean called me that same week about their offer, and I found myself pacing my apartment for hours trying to decide. I told him I needed to split my time between their outreach program and staying at Lexington High because these students had changed me as much as I'd changed them. He agreed to a hybrid position after I explained that real classrooms kept me grounded in what actually worked versus what looked good on paper. Tyler's Stanford acceptance letter arrived 3 days later, conditional on him completing preparatory courses, but he surprised everyone by turning it down. He showed me his response letter where he wrote that he needed more time to build real skills before he deserved to be there. His dad almost had a heart attack when Tyler said he might reapply in 2 years, or might not go to college at all if he found something better. 3 months passed before the reformed AP exam results came in, and our class average was way lower than previous years, but every single point was honestly earned. Tyler got a 3, which wasn't great by old standards, but he framed that score report on his bedroom wall with "my first real grade" written underneath in permanent marker. At graduation in June, Tyler sat in the audience as a gap year student, while Chloe gave her valedictorian speech about how authentic failure teaches more than fake success. She talked about how I'd taught them to be honest about what they knew and brave about what they didn't, and half the parents looked confused while the students cheered. My inbox started flooding with messages from teachers across the country who were trying our methods, like one from Ohio who wrote that her students were struggling more but learning better. Parents were calling the school board demanding easier grades, but the students were actually excited about programming for the first time in years. The movement had spread to over 200 schools by July, way beyond anything I'd imagined when I first walked into that classroom. Tyler spent the summer working on his first real program for his dad's startup, just a simple authentication module that took him 6 weeks to get right. His commit message when he finally pushed it to production read basic but bulletproof, with a note thanking me for teaching him that simple and correct beats complex and broken. His dad called me crying, saying it was the first time Tyler had ever finished something without shortcuts or lies. Linda got promoted to district curriculum director in August and immediately started implementing honest assessment across all subjects, not just computer science. Parent complaints flooded the school board meetings, but student engagement score went through the roof as kids finally felt like they were learning real things. She told me that real learning was harder than grade inflation, but infinitely more valuable for the kids' futures. Guido Van Rossum personally flying in to check out a high school coding class is like Shakespeare dropping by English Lit. Tyler's calculator program just became the most famous basic project in Python history. Jackson started at MIT that fall and immediately joined their education reform committee, sending me photos of his dorm room where he'd hung my picture next to Alan Turing and John von Neumann. His message said I'd taught him that knowing what you don't know is the beginning of wisdom, which made me tear up at my desk. By September, I was standing in front of my new AP computer science class, looking at a mix of eager and terrified faces who'd heard about what happened last year. One boy in the back reminded me so much of Tyler with his cocky smile and nervous foot tapping that I almost laughed. I wrote "Welcome to Honest Computing" on the board and turned to face them. I told them they'd struggle, fail, debug, and sometimes want to quit, but everything they learned would be real, and that made all the difference. As I started writing our first real problem on the board, I caught my reflection in the window and saw my gray hair, reading glasses, and the biggest smile I'd had in years. They had no idea what they were in for, and honestly neither did I, because that's the beauty of real learning. You never know where it leads, only that the journey transforms everyone involved, teacher and student alike. Thanks for diving into all these questions with me. It was a blast figuring things out together. Can't wait to chase more curiosity next time. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.